Since the Bible is the only true source of information as to how man originally polluted himself, the means by which this was done, if we're to learn that means, we must search the Scriptures for the answer. The initial act of pollution was not of the atmosphere, or of the lakes, or of the waters, but of the person. And because the individual became polluted, he in turn polluted everything around him. But how did the individual pollute himself? What course of events was followed to become polluted? Well, the answer is clearly given to us in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Listen to the word of God. Genesis 3:6. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. There's a very vital lesson to be learned from this verse, and the lesson is this. Exactly the same steps that Eve followed in initially polluting herself, each of us today follow in polluting ourselves. The Bible calls personal pollution sin. Now, there's no other way to get around that. You can soften the language, you can not mention that word sin, but when you come right down to it, rebellion against God's wishes is sin. It is personal pollution. Eve followed a certain course when she polluted herself, and we're still following that same course today. On Back to the Bible today, we want to examine verse 6 and see the steps that Eve followed which caused her pollution. The first step is sight. Notice that nothing happened in the garden paradise to offend God until verse 6, which begins, And when the woman saw. She spied the luscious fruit, and she began the terrible path to disobedience. Don't you find it strange, friends, how sin usually begins with sight? Now, Eve is not the only biblical character to clearly depict this terrible path to sin. Take, for example, Achan. You remember him. Joshua records the conquest of the land of Canaan by the Israelites. The people had crossed the Jordan River, and they were in the land. They had miraculously defeated the outpost of Jericho, and they were confident of consistent victory over the inhabitants of the land. Then they came to that small town of Ai. It was a pushover, or so they thought. Only 3,000 soldiers were sent to fight against Ai, but they were soundly defeated. When the full story was known, it became apparent that one man caused the defeat of the superior Israelite armies. That man was Achan. Joshua had commanded the soldiers that they should not take any of the booty from their battles, but Achan did. His confession is made in Joshua chapter 7, verse 21. Listen to what Achan says. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight, then I coveted them and took them. And behold, they are hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Now, in verses like this, I'm always interested in the verbs. Did you notice what the first step in Achan's downfall was? He admits it himself. He says, when I saw among the spoils. Achan's personal pollution began with sight. David is still another example of the course a person takes when they pollute themselves. David was the popular king of Israel. He had everything: honor, popularity, valor, the respect of the armies, as well as the respect of the people. David should have been content, but he wasn't. David followed the path to sin when he became involved with a girl named Bathsheba. It all began innocently enough. David was living in the capital, Jerusalem, and one night he couldn't sleep. 2 Samuel 11, verse 2 records, And it came to pass at evening that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Now, friends, what happened to David? The same thing that happened to Achan and to Eve. The same thing that happens to each one of us, even today, as we continually pollute ourselves. David fell into sin in the usual manner, and from the roof he saw a woman. Sin usually begins with sight. But you say, there's nothing wrong in looking. Besides, sometimes you can't help that first look. Sometimes sin just crosses your path, and you can't avoid looking at it. Well, that's true. But you can always avoid that second look. In addition to that, much sin that just happens to cross our path could be avoided if we corrected our path. We ought to try as much as possible not to allow our path to take us where sin abounds. You remember that Paul told the Thessalonians to abstain from every appearance or presence of evil. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22. He counseled young Timothy to flee youthful lusts. 2 Timothy 2:22. In other words, it may be impossible not to catch a glimpse of something that would pollute us personally. But as much as is possible, we ought to steer clear of the sight of sin. That first look may not be sin in itself, but it certainly leads to the second step. The second step in the course which pollutes ourselves. From our key verse, Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, we learn what that second step is. The second step on the pathway to pollution is desire. Now, although sin was initiated when Eve spied the forbidden fruit, the actual beginning of her pollution was when she desired what she knew God had commanded she should not have. You see, sight alone was no crime, but desire was. This was a tree to be desired to make one wise. Now, why did Eve desire this tree? What was wrong with wanting to be wise? Well, absolutely nothing, except when one becomes proud in his wisdom, or when such wisdom is forbidden by God. Eve had her pick of any tree of the garden, except this one, and under the influence of Satan, this was the one she desired. It was this desire which dragged Eve down, which eventually caused her to disobey God and pollute herself. Had she stopped with the sight of the tree and told the serpent to stop tempting her, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. But what about Achan? Did he continue on the course of sin by desire? He certainly did. In Joshua 7, verse 21, Achan confesses, "When I saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold, 50 shekels weight, then I coveted them." First, he saw the forbidden booty, and that sight was no crime. It was just lying there. He couldn't help but see it. But the longer he looked at it, the more he wanted it. Finally, he coveted or desired it, and in so doing, he took the next step into personal pollution. And what about our friend David? It sounds like a rerun of Eve and Achan. David was simply out for a walk upon the roof of his house, and by accident he happened to see a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look on. Now, this was a common practice, and who could blame David for happening to spy a beautiful woman? But the next verse, 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, tells us a bit more about poor innocent David. "And David sent and inquired about the woman. And the one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" You see, David may have accidentally spied Bathsheba taking a bath, but it was no accident when he sent and inquired about her. This was a deliberate act of desire. He wanted to know more about this beauty. And what he found out was not only that she was the object of his desire, but that she was also a married woman. How much better if David would have stopped at that first look. Now he has lowered himself one more step on the ladder that leads to pollution. Sight and desire, the first two steps on the path to pollution. The third step in sin is indulgence. And here it is, right here as the plot thickens. Again, our key verse is Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. And when the woman saw, step 1, that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired, step 2, to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, step 3. There you have the first act of pollution in a nutshell. God had commanded that Adam and Eve not eat of the fruit of the tree. God the Creator knew what He was doing. The ecological balance was exact. All that man and woman had to do was obey God's one command, and they would enjoy a pollution-free paradise forever. However, she took of the fruit and did eat. And this sad tale is the tale of how pollution eventually comes to us. By becoming polluted personally, Eve shortly polluted everything around her. She saw the fruit, then Satan led her to desire it. But when she took of the fruit and bit into it, she did so under her own volition. And in essence, she said, I don't care about the consequences. Just give me what I desire. Friends, that problem exists today with those who do not care about the environmental consequences. They just want the desire of their heart. Again, Achan provides an example of indulging in sin as he desired. You'll remember that he saw the beautiful garment, the silver, the gold, and then it says, Joshua chapter 7, verse 21, he coveted them and took them. Exactly the same steps. And with David, the story is the same. He saw the beautiful woman, then he desired her, and before he knew it, David sent messengers and took her. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 4. He took her. He indulged in that which was forbidden by God, just as Achan did, and just as Eve did. He would have to suffer the same consequences as Achan and Eve. Each one of these individuals tumbled down the course to sin. They saw, they desired, they indulged. How unfortunate this is. All the sin and pollution which plagues us today is a direct result of seeing, desiring, and indulging. Man has thoroughly polluted himself because he has heeded the suggestions of his greatest enemy and utterly disregarded the commands of his best friend. Now, this brings us to the real tragedy in the course of sin. The fourth step in sin is involvement. It would have been bad enough for Eve to take a prolonged look at the forbidden fruit. It would have been bad enough for her to desire the forbidden fruit. And it would have been bad enough for her to have indulged in that forbidden fruit and thus polluted herself. But after that, she involved another in her sin. Eve saw the fruit. She desired to be wise. She took and did eat. And then Genesis 3:6 says, she gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. The tragedy of sin, friends, is that it always involves others. We hear a lot about personal freedom today. People are crying for the rights of individuals to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't affect anyone else. Gay rights, lesbian rights, every woman's right, the rights of consenting adults. But this is not what God's Word speaks about. An individual is a member of a society, and anything he or she does to himself or herself, he or she does to his society as well. If he wants to pollute himself, he ultimately pollutes the rest of us. You remember Achan? He's the one who stole the beautiful Babylonian garment, the silver and the gold. Did his sin affect anyone but him? It certainly did. Because of his sin, 36 men lost their lives at the Battle of Ai. Personal pollution always involves others. And what about David? It was Uriah the Hittite who died in battle, not David, because sin always involves others. The course of pollution is a deadly one. When an individual finds himself or herself disobeying God and persists in that disobedience, the results are certain to be tragic. The course of pollution is one that constantly pulls us downward into the mire of sin. The steps, spying, desiring, indulging, and involving, are evident today every time we rebel against God. What a wonderful thing it would be indeed if pollution had never gained a foothold in paradise. But what a great God He is, to have provided a way to get us out of the pollution of ourselves and the pollution of our planet.